I'm going to take you through a very brief history of the last couple of years of West Ham United because it's relevant to the fan process and the letter that's been handed to the board about no confidence. So please bear with me because it is relevant. Now, it wasn't that long ago that we heard that David Sullivan was kind of suggesting that he wanted to start taking maybe life a little bit easier, take a bit more of a back seat, and not be so committed to running West Ham United. Well, Sullivan is 76 years of age now, and one would assume that he would finally prefer to do that and not be as involved, wouldn't he? And I guess we got kind of a little bit excited a couple of years back when he appointed Tim Steidten to what we thought was going to be the director of football at West Ham. Now, to most fans, a director of football has got a pretty relevant role to oversee the running of the footballing side of things, to develop the footballing direction, the whole club that would adopt, the identity and the playing style, if you like, of what the club should look like, which would include the overseeing of the academy, possibly the women's team, definitely the men's senior team. It'd include the hiring and firing of head coaches and the staff, the backroom staff that go with it. And of course, the overseeing of player transfers and so on. However, when Tim Steidten arrived, his first battle was to face a manager who did things in a very, very different way. David Moyes wanted full control. He wanted full control of the style of football. He wanted full control of transfers. He wanted players that would be, execute the style of football that he wanted on the pitch. And it was a clash of two footballing ideologies. Steidten apparently the new way, Moyes apparently the old way. David Moyes didn't want a DOF to tell him what style of football was going to be played. Far from it. Moyes wanted full control. And, it wasn't long before we started to hear rumours of discourse and disagreements between Moyes and Steidten. And it was inevitable that something would have to give. Now, it would have led, or it certainly did lead at that point, to one of two things. It could either be that one of these two men were going to leave, or that a compromise would be agreed. Now, compromises came first in the form of watering down the roles and responsibilities for both men. And I remember doing a show stating that this was time for David Sullivan to stand up and show some real leadership by telling Moyes that for the betterment of the club, in the long term, he had to go with the new regime. Instead, a mishmash happened where because of a number of good results leading up to Christmas 2023, Moyes was offered a new contract, albeit a contract that Sullivan knew he wouldn't accept because it took away the capacity for Moyes to be in charge of transfer activity. Now, Moyes took a long time, as we know, to decide whether he was going to accept that contract or not. And before you knew it, the results started to suffer, the contract offer was withdrawn, and by the end of the 23-24 season, Moyes was gone, much to the delight of Tim Steidten, who alluded to life being somewhat easier with Moyes not being in the picture. But it wasn't long before Steidten himself suffered the same fate because of what we initially deemed to be a great 2024 summer transfer window, turning out to be one which was probably one of the worst. But was Steidten afforded full control of the footballing side of things, or was he hard done by to lose his job? Now, Steidten seemed to be interested in the glitzy side of the business, jetting off everywhere to sign players, spending a long, long summer in Brazil. But other than that, he seemed either disinterested or not given the remit to oversee every single aspect of the footballing side of West Ham. Instead, he seemed to be a glorified, chief transfer negotiator, someone who was good at closing deals rather than being in control over the direction of the footballing club. That seemed more evident when it came to deciding Moyes' successor. A proper director of football would have been in charge of bringing in a new head coach. And despite recommendations made by Steidten, David Sullivan went with his own method and resulting in recruiting a manager who, on paper at least, seemed to be a great success. I mean, after all, if you've managed the Spanish national team, the Real Madrid team, and won a European trophy, You've got to be half decent, haven't you? But as with similar situations a few years ago, where Manuel Pellegrini and his director of football, Mario Husilos, were hired and fired by Sullivan, the same fate was handed to Tim Steidten and to Moyes' successor, Houdan Lopetegui. And by January early this year, we were back to square one. And the only solution was to bring in what seemed to be a steady pair of hands in the guise of Graham Potter. To some fans, a David Moyes Mark II. So why have I told you all this? And what has it got to do with the recent letter handed to the board by the FAB, which is backed by Hammers United and has picked up a lot of traction on mainstream media? Well, the letter sent by the FAB is one declaring a vote of no confidence in the board over its handling of footballing matters, all ones I've just described to you. The hiring and firing of managers or head coaches, the hiring and firing of directors of football, the purchasing of players on long-term contracts and big wages, which result in West Ham losing millions, the stadium move, which promised so much but has delivered so little, or certainly delivered no more than we could have achieved or would have achieved had we stayed at Upton Park. All of these things are seen as a failure of this current board. Now, it was only, a couple of weeks ago that Karen Brady had been bragging on TalkSport as to how much of a success the move to the London Stadium was. But we all know that those were hollow words to a media who were already made aware of the problems that lie beneath the surface at West Ham United. And to be honest with you, I was particularly disappointed with TalkSport hosts Sean Custis and Henry Winter for not having challenged Brady on that show. Instead, they seem to be rather in awe of her even bothering to even turn up in the first place. So what are the main highlights of the open letter to the board? Well, they include concerns about us being broke, despite the fact that we won a European trophy and selling Declan Rice for 100 odd million pounds. The club is claiming financial distress. Well, it's pretty obvious. I've just mentioned why we're in the financial mess that we're in, because as I've been saying for quite some time, for probably well over a year or so now, our player transfer strategy is and always has been haphazard. Buying players at a premium, putting them on top wages, putting them on long-term contracts. When they don't work out, we sell them for a loss. And where we can't sell them, we send them out on loan, where we still pay half or more of their wages whilst they represent other teams. We have done this time and time again, and it's no wonder now that we're pleading poverty. The letter goes on to say about an aging, uncompetitive squad, poor scouting infrastructure, and the derided training facilities. Now, this one is interesting because it was only the other day that I did a show mentioning that I believe we'd gone a long way to reducing the average age of the squad in this summer's transfer window. But are we competitive enough? Well, I guess only time will tell throughout this season whether we are or not. A poor squad infrastructure? Yeah, agreed. But are we finally getting to see signs of improvement under the leadership of head of recruitment, Carl McCauley? And as for the training facilities, I've seen them only from the outside, but I've got no idea how technologically advanced they may be on the inside, so I can't genuinely answer that. Now, what about the stadium? A supporter survey of over 9,000 respondents confirmed that the London Stadium is the most criticised ground in the country, with a poor matchday experience. You know my feelings regarding the stadium atmosphere. Most of us have been there when it's been rocking, but we need to have something to be cheering about. And this is usually the stance also taken by the club. In fact, in the same TalkSport interview that Brady said, she said this as much, that it's down to the fans. They need to support the team more and create the atmosphere. She was pretty dismissive, in that whole approach, and suggesting that if we were winning more games, the atmosphere would be better. Is she right? But no matter how Brady wants to dress it up, we all know that the major improvements are needed to make that stadium a more footballing-like atmosphere. We could get rid of that wall between the home and away fans. We could introduce designated standing areas, designated family areas. And we could be more stringent on who buys tickets so that we don't have to deal with vast swathes of away supporters in the home end. Now, the board will argue that most of these things are out of their hands, but we know um, that they can negotiate with the stadium owners over making some improvements if they really wanted to, in order to improve the atmosphere. But I'm not so sure that the board are that keen. Now, the broken promises, the move to Stratford was supposed to take West Ham to the next level. Yet commercial revenues now lag rivals. The letter says that we're behind the likes of Bournemouth, Brighton, Brentford, Crystal Palace, who are outperforming us both on the pitch and off it. Now, this is one thing I wholeheartedly agree with. Now, Brady suggested that had it not been for the stadium move, we would not have had the European glory that we did. What a load of hogwash. We had European nights at the Boleyn, and I don't buy that we've progressed to the next level. None of us buy that. Well, certainly not on a consistent basis anyway. The sporadic progress is not worthy of a stadium move. Now, I've got to be honest, I wonder, the whole thing about commercial aspects, I wonder if anyone's done a study on West Ham, how much we were paying for the Boleyn, to run it, own it, and all that sort of stuff, and how much revenue we were getting back, because we were in charge of things like, drinks and food and all that sort of stuff. I wonder if anyone's done a study to compare now our income streams against our outgoings at the London Stadium compared to that of the Boleyn. I bet you they're not much different. So what do the FAB, what do FAB and Hammers United want to happen? Well, they're saying that they want an appointment of a professional full-time executive or executives with proper footballing and commercial expertise. They want an end to board interference. They want a modern leadership structure with the club moving away from being an analog club into the digital world. And there have been calls for the board to resign or sell up, although in fairness, that's not been specifically mentioned or stated in this open letter. And how do I think the board are going to respond to these demands? Well, I know, Brady, despite the fact that the FAB have mentioned that there are planned protests, which I understand to include a march before the Crystal Palace game and a proposed boycott of the Monday night televised game against Brentford, FAB have offered an olive branch to the board to engage in meaningful dialogue. In meaningful dialogue, and I imagine West Ham will definitely enter that dialogue with FAB. Now, on FAB's own website, it's described as West Ham United's primary mechanism for formal consultation and engagement, with representatives sharing their views on issues which impact the club's fan base, including club strategic vision and objectives, London stadium plans, operational matchday processes, and any proposals relating to club heritage items. So there is the scope there. FAB or FAB do have that remit to discuss all these things. And even Karen Brady described FAB as one of the standout developments of last season. And this is the primary platform for consultation and a cornerstone of ongoing relationships with the fans. Let's be in no doubt, it's going to be Karen Brady who's going to be doing all the talking and all the negotiating with FAB. And it's highly unlikely that David Sullivan will come anywhere near these conversations. He's rarely engaging with the FAB in the past, and it's highly unlikely he's going to engage now. But I could be wrong. Now, to a point, let's go back to the points that they want to cover. To appoint a professional full-time executive with proper footballing expertise would mean David Sullivan stepping aside for this to happen. But I suspect Sullivan will point to the appointments of Husilos and Steiden to suggest that this approach that we've tried before has failed twice. But there will be no acknowledgement that part of the reasons for the failure have been because of the board being involved in decisions, hence interfering, which is the second demand, don't interfere. And I would wager that Sullivan will talk about his 30-odd years of managing football clubs, so why would there be anyone more qualified than him to take over? Now, when it comes to the commercial aspects, Um, West Ham only recently appointed Nathan Thompson, who's executive director for commercial marketing, digital, and content. Thompson has been responsible for a variety of recent commercial partnerships, which include the current shirt sponsorship of Boyle Sports. Now, I suspect that when it comes to talking about digitalizing West Ham United, Brady will turn this on its head and suggest that with the appointments of head of recruitment Carl McCauley and football data analyst Max Hahn, that we are a club that's heading in a more digital direction rather than the analog one that's been suggested. And she's likely to plead for time to see how this season pans out with the player purchases that we've made under the guidance of Macaulay. Now, as for resigning, the board can't sack itself. I've had this conversation with Hammers United. Sometimes the wording is really important. You can't sack the board. You can't ask them to resign. They own the club. I guess Sullivan could sack Brady, but that's highly, highly unlikely. And as for the selling up, I can't see that happening either. I doubt very much Sullivan would remotely consider selling up. And as many fans already believe, he's likely to hand West Ham over to his son. Now, I think a few promises will be made, to look out, how we can improve the stadium atmosphere. But the likely outcome will probably not be enough to please the fan base. Let's face it, we all want the stadium to be knocked down and rebuilt, which is not going to happen anytime soon either. Look, I'm all for backing this approach. We do need change. We absolutely do need a proper director of football to come in who's not going to be hindered by the board making decisions over him or over her. We do need someone like that who's going to oversee the footballing side of things. But I can't see David Sullivan relinquishing that responsibility. I wish I could, but I can't. So it's going to be interesting to see what really happens with this. I'm all for it. I'm backing it. I feel that we will achieve more standing together. I've said this before with Hammers United being at the forefront of this, and it's great now that the FAB are also at the forefront. It's going to be interesting to see what happens. Watch this space because there's going to be a lot more coming in our direction.